Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. So today's two presentations will be about chatbooks, which integrate LLMs into Wolfram Notebooks in a nice and creative way. And we'll also be talking about the Wolfram prompt repository and some more extra information about LLMs. Our two presenters today of those two talks respectively will be Theo Gray, who is the co-founder of Wolfram Research and writer of the notebook interface itself. And that notebook interface is, of course, still used in our products today. So that'll be a fantastic talk. And it's a great pleasure to have him here to tell us about kind of these new innovations in the notebook space. He's also a BAFTA Award winner and recipient of the Ig Nobel Prize, among many other things, including the periodic table, which is quite an amusing invention. You should look that up if you haven't seen anything about it yet. The next talk will be given by Bob Sam Heinrich, who is a development manager at Wolfram Research and master of all things repository, whether that's functions, courseware, Packlets, or now prompts. So with these prompts, you'll be able to do quite a few useful and rather amusing things. For example, here's just one example of using a pre-built prompt that I think is quite funny. You can ask for the LLM to respond as if it's an old-time gangster. You can ask, what is the most novel feature in Wolfram language? And then you hope that OpenAI servers are responding quickly so they don't take too much time from this introduction. There you have it. So this is a very, this is kind of a bit of a joke use, but you can ask for very particular things here, like things that will change the grammatical structure of what you've stated, or things that will respond in a very particular way. So this is a very extensive capability, and Bob will tell us about that. Also here with us today is Richard Hennigan, who's a software developer who works on LLM functionality as well, and in fact contributed some of the earliest LLM functionality to Wolfram language. We're already getting some interesting questions, so I think I will go ahead and hand it off to Theo to start his presentation.
Okay, very good. So first, very brief sort of history of how we arrived at the notion of chat notebooks. If you think about the history of interfaces for computer language sort of systems, including Mathematica, the first thing, the original thing, was what is currently referred to as a sort of a teletype or a glass teletype interface, where you give an input and it gives an output. You give another input, it gives another output. That was how one interacted with Mathematica in the very first versions back in the 80s. It's an immutable record. It just kind of, back and forth. And if you want to, modify a question that modify an input, you have to repeat it down below. And it's a very sort of, rigid step-by-step thing. And there were various early attempts at doing better than that. And we came up with what I think was sort of the most successful evolution of that notion for interacting with systems, where the basic model is you have some text as input and it's going to give you, originally just text as output, but now maybe it's also graphics or interactive things or whatever. But it's basically a prompt response system, which we called notebooks. And they were, basically the same now as they were in the, 1988 or so version 1, just with lots of new features and lots of elaborations. And I think that model of an editable document, it sounds like most people based on the poll are reasonably familiar with how notebooks work in general. So I won't go into that. But, the notion of an editable interactive document where you can change things anywhere in the document, you can rerun things in place. You can place new output on top of old output. You don't have to retype anything. You can kind of build up a sequence of calculations and evaluate them all at once. All those sorts of things. This turns out to be a really good idea for how to interact. And the fact that it's been copied by Jupyter Notebooks is very flattering, and acknowledgement of what a good idea it is for interacting with any system like that. So then if you think now about how interactions with chat systems work, chat bots included, they're kind of typically back to the old glass teletype model, where it's just a back and forth. And if you're talking to, if you're messaging back and forth to another human being, this makes a lot of sense because the conversation happened in a certain order, and it doesn't really make sense to go back and change, something in that conversation unless you're trying to make a screenshot to post it on Reddit or something. The conversation is what it is. But interacting with a chatbot, and I think even OpenAI's interface has now evolved to the point where you actually can go back and have sort of more of a Groundhog Day kind of interaction with the thing, where you get to redo conversations and change them and modify them and see, what would have happened if I'd asked this other query instead. And that's exactly the kind of, structure of interaction that notebooks are good at. So it seemed like a pretty straightforward idea, at least in retrospect, that we should simply hook up the notebook model to chatbots and OpenAI's GPTs initially, but eventually all of them. So having that background, let me just show you very practically how does this actually work. So I have here, this is a perfectly ordinary, I just said new, I made a new notebook. And if I'm using, this is version 13.2, so the current release version. As long as I have restarted it recently, so that there's sort of auto update mechanism that happens, you'll get a new little icon up here in the corner, which is the Chat Notebook settings icon button. And if you click it, you'll get this choice here. And if we click that, we now suddenly have a whole bunch of new options. And just to be clear, you don't have to do anything to make this happen. Although I guess actually, yeah, the very, very first time you do this, you launch your 13.2 triggering the auto update. You may have to restart again so you actually get the button. And then the first time you click enable AI chat features, you're going to get a little smaller thing which says, do you want to install the chat features? And if you click the install button there, it will then download the necessary packlet to get you all of this. But you don't have to do any kind of manual downloading of anything. It's just click the button and you'll get it. So I now have a chat-enabled notebook. And what does this mean? Well, I could do all the same things as if I just start typing. I've magnified things here, so hopefully people can see it on the screen share. It's just an ordinary notebook. There's nothing particularly fancy going on. Actually, let me just check. Is there? Yes, there's not. But I have one additional capability, which is I can type a single quote character. And you can't really see me doing that, but if I type single quote, I now get a new type of input cell, a chat input cell, in which I am now having a conversation with the chatbot. And I can, I can do whatever I want. So, and it responds in much the same way as it would if you were doing this on OpenAI's web interface, except that you notice that it sort of feels like we should be talking about Wolfram language. And we're going to learn a lot more about the different sort of personas, personalities that you can interact with. But by default, you're talking to a chatbot which kind of has a focus on Wolfram language, which makes sense because we're here in Mathematica. Just like as in the OpenAI interface, you have history. So I could say, I'll type another single quote here. What is my name? And whoops, shift return. Yeah, it's shift return, same as for a regular input cell. And so you see it's got this history. But then the key fundamental thing you could do here that makes it a notebook and not a glass teletype is you can change something. So reevaluate that, and reevaluate this, and okay, well, interesting. Yeah, so they it's oddly different answers. It's a way of saying you seem to be Sam. But that's one of the charming features of these bots is that they're kind of random and they have personalities. So anyway, but in both cases, you see it's demonstrating that it is aware of the history. And so one question is, how much history is it aware of? So let's try, what's the last Wolfram language thing I did? And so you see it's reached back. And in fact, when you do an evaluation, a chat evaluation like this, it has access to everything above that cell in the notebook. So it's got the complete contents of your notebook up to the point where your chat input cell is. And this is very useful because it means that you can ask it questions about stuff that you did somewhere in the notebook, and it will know what you're talking about. But on the other hand, it's also sometimes really not what you want, because sometimes you kind of want to start on a new topic, or you maybe just don't want to send that stuff, or maybe you have a very large notebook and it's actually costs money to unless you have the free account, but then you have very limited capacity. The longer the history, the more tokens you're using up. And so you might want to just sort of limit the context. And for that, we have a thing called a chat block divider, which you get by typing the twiddle character. So shift backtick, and you get this bar. And if I now, if I repeat the copy and paste this input cell, repeat that, it doesn't know. So it's got no history here. This is just a block. And okay, so that's like the basics. You've got history, but you can block the history. Now, what sorts of things can you actually do that would be useful? So what are some things you could do? Well, being that we're in a notebook and we're interested in Mathematica stuff, or Wolfram language stuff, one of the most useful things that you can possibly do is ask it to create Wolfram language code for you. And so let me give you an example here. Give me a sine wave. And now I'm going to add something that we will discuss in more detail. I think Bob will discuss it more in his section of the talk also. Don't use any tools. That's something I didn't have to do last week when I gave the same talk. But I do now, because the thing has new capabilities, which are not exactly what I want to demo, and some of the features for enable and disabling these tools are not 100% functional. But you can just ask it not to do the tool thing, and it won't. All right, so here we go. It has produced, you notice I was very vague, just give me a sine wave. And because of the sort of contextualized prompting that it knows it's supposed to be helpful in a Mathematica Wolfram sort of way, it produced a piece of Wolfram code. And it even gave me access labels. And there's a button here. If I hover over it, I get a button. If I click the button, it pastes it down and evaluates it. So sure enough, here we get a nice little picture of a plot of a sine wave. And it picked, very, very reasonable domain for the plot. It's really quite smart about this. Now, here's the thing, which the first time I saw this, it was one of those moments where you think, yeah, okay, we're living in the future now. Say, make me an interface where I can change the frequency of that. Don't use any tools. So I think of this like, for those of you that saw the first Star Trek movie where Scotty picks up the mouse and starts talking to it. But it actually works. And if I click here, boom. So now I have, I have a user interface for changing the frequency of a sine wave. And that's just, that's mind-blowing. I don't know. I think it'll be a while before I get used to the fact that that just works. And I think this environment, this sort of notebook environment that we're in, and the fact that there's, we didn't basically have to do anything, compiling, creating a file, executing it somewhere. We just said, let me change the frequency, and boom, there it is, seconds later. And we can look at the code for those of you on the Eliezer Yankowski's side of the paranoia scale, you can look at the code. Like, this is what the LLM has written. This is pretty straightforward. I think there's very little chance that this piece of Wolfram language code is going to try to take over the world or whatever. Wolfram language is very compact and relatively easy to read. And so you feel comfortable clicking here to actually evaluate it. So how far can you go with this? Well, it turns out you can go pretty far. Like, let me say, add another sine wave and show me both sine waves and their sum. So every time I do this talk, I'm just making up the specific sentences differently. So far, it's always got it right, even though I asked the same question in many different ways. And we'll see if it got it right this time, too. Oh, it's gotten really fancy. So sometimes it actually makes these things more verbose than I might like. But let's see if it produced code that actually works. Yeah, so it's given me a thing where I can visualize beat frequencies between different sine waves. And, but this is, I don't know, these variable names are too long, and I don't need the labels. So, whoops, oh, I went back too far. Okay. Do that again with shorter variable names and don't label the plot. Yeah, so there we go. Now it's giving me a nice, compact little piece of code. And again, with very sensible, like, it used good judgment in figuring out what would be reasonable, parameters, what range of frequencies, what would be sensible. But maybe I do want to go a lot farther. So, of course, this is just, at this point, once it's pasted in here, this is just an ordinary input cell, same as if you typed it in yourself. And if you want to change any of these parameters, you're free to do that. And you now have, you can use this as a starting point. And I think that for many people, it's going to be most useful to have it generate pieces of code like this, and then use them as starting points. And I think of it as sort of like the ultimate example generator. Like if you went to our documentation and what you really want is you want to make this interface. You need an example to start from. How do you use manipulate? What is the syntax? Well, this thing will give you an extremely targeted example that may not be 100% of what you want, but it might be 90% of the way there, and that's just phenomenally useful. As far as being able to generate much bigger, whole 10-page long programs, I don't think it's there yet. Although I have tried some experiments taking like a 1-page long Mathematica Wolfram language function that I wrote years ago and just give it that and say, improve the variable names, make more sensible variable names. And it did that remarkably well. It basically duplicated the code, except it gave the variable names descriptive, it gave them descriptive names based on how they were actually being used in the code, using a level of a depth of analysis that I found surprising. So I think that people are going to find a lot of use in this system. And there's other ways that it can help you with language, with Wolfram language in particular. So let's say, for example, let's say I think I know what I'm doing, and I want to make a column of ABC. So I evaluate that. Well, wait a minute. Actually, why is that thinking now? Because, Rick, why is that thinking? Because I have it turned off. Huh.
Try clicking it twice. That was a bug.
Well, actually, I'm going to turn on. I'm just going to turn on the automatic result analysis. So I'm going to show that separately. But so this is a thing which you can turn on, And let me delete this output so we get a fresh start. So, but you notice that didn't work. Like this is not the right syntax for making a column. And I think at this point it is going to now helpfully explain that to me. Or maybe not. Should I click it again?
Yeah, you can see what it
Oh,
said.
it didn't. Okay, it didn't show it. It did it, but it didn't show it to me. Interesting. Okay, so what's happened with this option here enabled, the automatic result analysis, it's going to actually watch the ordinary Wolfram language inputs that you evaluate and see if there's a problem. And even if it's not an explicitly a syntax error, it's kind of figured out that this probably didn't do what I want, and it shows me how to do it. And I can click there, and now I get a column. And it turns out it's just really quite surprisingly good at this. So if you imagine that you're a complete beginner, you've never used Wolfram language before, and you want to plot a sine function, but for some reason you don't want to ask the LLM to do it, you're too proud, so you do your best, and you type plot sine x from 0 to 2 pi. Now, this is not Mathematica syntax. It's not going to work, right? But it detected that there was a syntax error and is now proceeding to fix my code for me. And again, it's remarkable how good it is at this. Like you can give it almost unintelligible gibberish, and very often it will figure out what you meant and correct it for you. So I think in terms of people's ability to kind of get started using Wolfram language, this is absolutely revolutionary. Okay, so now let's see. Move on to personas. So you've been noticing here, or maybe you weren't, but when we do start a new chat input cell, there's a little icon here. It's supposed to look like a wolf. So this represents the personality, the sort of targeted flavor of chatbot that you're going to be talking to. If I click on it, I have some choices. And some of these are more useful than others. Groot, for example, is a personality which no matter what you ask it, it answers, I am Groot. And that's just what it does. Not necessarily useful, but kind of fun. Code Assistant is the default. Code Writer is kind of like Code Assistant, except you notice up here it was giving me like lots of explanations and such. Code Writer is supposed to pretty much just give you the code and assume that you can figure out what it meant. Wolfie, I'm never really sure what that's supposed to be. It's supposed to be more a fun sort of form of Wolfram Assistant. The 19th century British novelist, you can do things like short story about dogs. And we might see if the history contaminates it. Like it might talk about sine waves related to dogs because it sees that we've been working on sine waves, but maybe not. So anyway, now we're getting the 19th century British novel version of a story about dogs. Now I said short story. What are we going on about? Okay, so now let's take this again, and I want to just show you Bernardo. So we have the great honor of having Rick Hennigan on this call, who is the developer of the Bernardo personality. And Bernardo is, it's a fun, it's like a, tell me about, I'm sure it will have a lot to say. It's fun. It's a little bit snarky. It will sometimes snap at you. And what makes Bernardo special is that it was, when Rick sort of first started showing people what it would do, it was so compellingly interesting and fun that it kind of convinced us to really put a lot of effort into developing the whole infrastructure around it to turn this thing into a real product that you could actually do it. And it's basically a Wolfram language assistant, but with an attitude and some fun. So we basically had to develop the entire personalities system so that Bernardo could be one of those personalities. And there we go. And later in this talk, Bob is going to tell you about where you get these personalities from. There's a dialog box where you can get more of them from the prompt repository, and he'll show you all about that later. What are we doing for time? So we've done that. The fancy features in chat input cells, Bob is going to talk about. So I want to talk about two more things. So this is what's called a chat-enabled notebook, which basically means it's a normal notebook primarily intended for doing Wolfram language stuff, but it's got the ability to call up chat features. And in fact, starting probably in, I think the plan is version 14, all notebooks will be chat-enabled, and these will just be normal notebooks. And if you don't invoke any specific chat features, it won't be any different from a regular notebook, but you'll always have that ability. The other thing that we have is say new chat-driven notebook. And so this is a notebook. It's a little bit like the Wolfram Alpha notebooks in the sense that the default input is chat input as opposed to, so in other words, if I just start typing without typing the single quote, I get a chat input cell. And I think the default personality is different, right? It's plain chat, which means it's not biased nearly as strongly towards wanting to talk about Wolfram Alpha or about Wolfram language stuff. It's a more generic. It's not completely generic. If you ask for code, it will give you code in Wolfram language rather than in Python or something. But it's a more sort of generic where you can just kind of have a chat with almost the raw chat bot. What is it useful for? Well, a couple of things. One is if I find it much more convenient just as a way of using the different chat models, because I'd rather be here in this notebook environment than in some web interface. The other thing I think, though, is that we may find over time that there are more and more people who use Wolfram language product, Wolfram desktop products, cloud products, whatever, but never actually write Wolfram language themselves. Because as it's already the point, as you saw earlier in the demo, that you can do quite a lot, and a lot of stuff that basic users might want to do without actually writing your own code. And in a chat-driven notebook, that's might be what you do. You just sort of type chat inputs that say get this file, do some data analysis on it, sort of just talking at it, and you don't ever really feel the need to do your own actual Wolfram language coding. You can always, if you type command 9 for creating an input cell, you can get Wolfram language input cells, but it's just not the default. And I think it'll be interesting to see over time how that develops as a mode of using our products. And then, so the last thing is the notion of chat notebooks as a platform, which is what I think is where probably the greatest power is going to come. So you can, much as in, just as you could in the past, there's a whole elaborate set of front-end programming features, things like the ability to create user interfaces, like a manipulate is one example, but you can completely override the behavior of notebooks. You can make special template notebooks where it looks like it's a dialog box, or it looks like it's some kind of a form that you're filling out. You can use Wolfram language coding to develop products within the notebook environment, with the notebook being the user interface. And we're sort of integrating the ability to access LLMs into that application development environment. And Bob is going to show some sort of programmatic language ways of doing that. There are also, and these are still in flux, so I can't actually demo it particularly well. There's the ability to have basically like a chat interface but one that is directed by a higher level logic. So I have this thing called Jerrybot, which is a little experiment that I've been doing with a friend, Jerry Glynn, who's an expert math tutor. And so what we were working on is trying to create a notebook in which, if you were to plop a beginning algebra student, like a middle school student or something like that, give them an environment where the chatbot will respond appropriately to their level of education. If you just ask OpenAI, GPT-4, whatever, to explain exponential notation, it'll do it kind of at a college level, use all kinds of terms that the student doesn't understand, doesn't know because they haven't learned this stuff. But by hiding what I refer to as sort of micro prompting, little system prompts hidden within the sections headings, you can get it to actually interact with students in a way that is appropriate to their current level of knowledge. And this not 100% working, but that's these inputs outputs are working as well as they are because of this prompting, which is hidden in this notebook. So this is like an environment in which it's like if you imagine a human tutor, right? They might be talking to a college student, but now they're retuned and they know that they're talking to a sixth grader, and so they're going to adjust their language. And then this is another experiment that I think has great potential. So the idea would be this particular prompt. Right now I'm showing it in the notebook because that's all I can do at the moment. But a prompt like this would be something you could evaluate automatically after every student interaction within this notebook environment. And so I've just asked the LLM, look at the notebook history, look at all the things that the student has done, and tell me, do they understand exponential notation or not? It's one of these questions that for decades, programmed learning, or computerized online educational systems have been trying to figure out, how do we tell, does the student understand this unit or not? And the history to date has been extremely poor. That it's just really bad at determining that basic question. And you give it a multiple choice quiz, and that's really very poor proxy for understanding. But this thing, just right out of the box, gives a very nuanced and correct assessment, which can then be boiled down into a single yes or no answer, which is no, the student needs more practice. So the idea would be that one could program this notebook so that these two prompts are being done automatically, invisibly to the student, but they then direct the flow of activity in this notebook to either, continue asking, doing more practice problems, explaining again, or move on to the next question. This is an example of the sort of hidden prompting that causes the thing within this environment to behave in a certain way. And the idea would be that would not be visible to the student. So I think there's great potential in using the notebook and the notebook sort of application development environment in connection with LLMs to create special purpose applications. Oh, actually, no, here's a good question. This is something I forgot to talk about the API key. Right. So something I glossed over here is that the very first time after I click enable, I click enable chat features, and then I install the packlet, and then the very first time I do an evaluation, I'm actually going to get another dialog, which you didn't see here, which is going to say you need an API key to use this, which is a thing that sort of authorizes you to access the OpenAI web, programmatic web API. And you have to get one of those yourself at this point. And it's free, and the dialog box includes instructions for how to do that, but you basically have to go to OpenAI and create an account, either a free account or you can pay them. And then there's a section on the website where you can get an OpenAI key, or API key, and then you copy and paste that into the dialog box, and then you're done. You only ever have to do that once, and the product, we will remember that key for you, and always use it from then on. that's definitely is a subject of much discussion, that this is very awkward, and wouldn't it be a lot better if this somehow just worked? And one of the fundamental problems with that is that when you ask a question like this, well, this goes off to vast server farms, chewing up huge amounts of electricity, and hundreds, or I don't know who knows how many GPUs all working simultaneously to deliver an answer to you, and that costs real money. And although they'll give you a certain amount of queries for free, pretty soon they start wanting money, and legitimately and unavoidably so. This is too much computation to just give away. So if we wanted to make this seamless for our users, where it would just work, we would need to have some way of passing on that cost. So which could be through a subscription, if you have a subscription to Wolfram Desktop, or if you have service credits. There's many ways one could imagine this working, but it's quite complicated, both technically and sort of business-wise. What is the most sensible way to do this? And of course, there's then questions about, right now it's pretty much OpenAI, but what about Google and Amazon and Facebook? And everybody's got their own, giant LLMs that are being developed, some of which are actually already available. Our intention is that we're going to allow you to, and in fact, I could show you, let's see if we go here. You can choose which model you want to talk to. So I've been talking to GPT-4 because it's amazing. GPT 3.5 is cheaper. And, eventually, as we have resources and time to develop it, this list will get longer and longer, and there will be multiple other LLMs, Bard or it's whatever, different ones that we will develop the necessary glue interface code for. And then there will become the question of how do you pay for those? And can we bundle all of those, make it so that what would be really cool is just like anyone you want to use, it just works. We handle all of the finances, and you get a bill at the end of the month for how much LLM did you use. But like I say, it's complicated, and we're still working on it.